The Supreme Court from day one said, we want your cameras in our courtroom. We want to be televised.
And so we became the first public affairs television network in the world to regularly cover an appellate court at any level.
This is an opportunity to educate the public about the judicial branch, which, frankly, people know very little about.
These courts are the people's courts, and I think it's important that people be allowed to see what goes on in the courtroom during these oral arguments.
All rise.
The first thing that we covered was a Supreme Court decision, an argument, an oral argument before the Supreme Court.
In 1993 and 94, we did this study, this feasibility study, on the establishment of a Washington Public Affairs television network. And we constructed a table of all the things that we could cover in addition to the state legislature, because one of the concerns that was expressed to us was, what are you going to do between legislative sessions? Well, we knew that there was plenty going on of a public policy nature. There were conferences, there were rule and regulation administrative hearings that had consequence, and so we constructed a weekly TV schedule of all the important things that could be done. And anyway, we put it into this report. We sent it out to all the newspapers, and every single newspaper in the state editorialized in favor of our establishment. Completely stunned us. We had no idea that would happen. Now here's the deal. The report was absolutely silent on the issue of coverage of the state Supreme Court. And it was because the U.S. Supreme Court had taken such a hard and fast position against ever having television cameras in the court that we just assumed that ethic would translate down to the state level. So we never even raised it.
To this day, the U.S. Supreme Court won't let cameras within 100 feet of the door of the place. I mean, so that just, makes me appreciate what our folks did all the more.
One day in 1994, I'm sitting in my home office working, and the phone rings. And I pick it up, and the voice on the other end says, "Hi, this is Bob. I'm with the state Supreme Court. Why did you leave us out?" And I said, I beg your pardon. He was the community relations public affairs guy. And I explained to him why it was that we thought that they wouldn't even entertain a proposal on our part. He said, "Wrong. Our members want to have a conversation with you about coverage of the state Supreme Court."
What helped us as a court was having Justice C.Z. Smith on the court, who had been in TV and the news business, I guess, and he kind of calmed our thoughts about, well, how scary is this going to be? And he was such a proponent that it really helped a lot of the rest of the court, who were maybe a little older school, about courts and cameras.
My knowledge of television was from watching TV. Justice Smith actually did know quite a bit about television. He'd earlier been before he was on the court, he'd been a commentator on KOMO in Seattle, and he knew quite a bit about television. Justice Smith and I met, talked to Denny Heck, who was then the president of TVW, and came back with a recommendation to the court that we should allow the gavel-to-gavel coverage of our hearings, and the court did approve our recommendation.
And so we became the first public affairs television network in the world to regularly cover an appellate court at any level. And it wasn't because we proposed it, it's because they called us up.
I have never received a negative comment about television in the courtroom of the Supreme Court of the state of Washington. I've received many positive comments.
For people to see justices out in the community with traveling court, for example, to see the justices ask penetrating questions, to see how we interact with the law and lawyers, it wouldn't be possible for the public or anyone else outside of the few people who are in the courtroom to see that and to understand how significant it is that we have a free and fair system of justice in this country, in this state.
Madam Chief Justice, and may it please the court, I'm Mike Laeria, and together with my co-counsel Charlotte Cassidy, who is seated here to my left, I represent Sammy Lee Levine.
Interestingly enough, it turns out that in the first couple years, the most popular thing on TVW were the oral arguments before the Supreme Court. And I think that surprised all of us. But, you know, what a wonderful validation for those Supreme Court justices that said, we're not afraid of this. Let's do this. What we're doing here is important. It matters. People need to see this.
I don't see any downside in allowing cameras in an appellate proceeding. I think when you talk about cameras in a trial court, that's a different issue because you're dealing with juries, witnesses, and so on. But arguments made by lawyers in front of 9 justices, I don't see any downsides.
And if it's not required, then why should they? And I guess what I'd like to hear from you is it your position that as a matter of law?
Early in my career here at the court, we had a case on water rights, and it was pitting sort of farmers against ranchers. And in the courtroom, there were, it was like at a wedding. There was 2 sides, and the ranchers are on one side and the farmers are on the other, and you knew which was the bride's side and which was the groom's side because at certain questions the audience would clap or groan. I'd never seen anything like it. And it made me think about the United States Supreme Court when they have huge groups of people out in front of their courthouse during the really important arguments.
I fervently wish that someday the United States Supreme Court would allow cameras in the courtroom there in Washington, D.C. Wouldn't it be wonderful if television had been invented back in the days of Marbury versus Madison, if we could see those arguments today?
The Supreme Court of the United States, it's mystifying to people in the public. What do they do? What do they look like? How do they ask questions? So as I sat through the hearings, I thought, this really demystified it for me. These people are just like me. They're just like me. They think like me. They ask the kinds of questions that I would ask. So I thought to myself, why would you want to keep the mystery around who you are as a bench and what you do for this country? I would think you would want to share that. And it was reassuring to me that these weren't strangers from a strange land. These were just other Americans who were serving their country in that capacity.
And it really doesn't promote the health, welfare, and safety of the citizens of Adams County, does it? To bring.
I'll never forget one time I was driving to Seattle and I pulled into the little rest area there in Fife and went over to get a cup of coffee from a volunteer there. And this fellow who I did not recognize came up and he said, "Oh, Justice Alexander, so glad to see you." And I said, "Sorry, I don't quite remember where we met." He said, "Oh, we've never met." He said, "But I watched the court on TVW." He said, "I am a TVW junkie." He said, I still remember him saying it. Or maybe he said, "I'm a Supreme Court junkie." I think that's what he said. He said, "I really enjoy watching the court on television."
Because it specifically says only on a roadway, that's essentially your argument and the Brown argument as well? Just last night, having my hair fixed at my salon, and I had never shared with my beauty operator what I do for a living. I'm sort of private about that. And she said, "You know, I was flipping through my channels the other night, and I was sure I saw you." So I was outed, and I said, "Well, yeah, you might have." And she said, "Well, you looked like you were on a court or something." So I thought it was really interesting that a person who has no connection to the legal community and certainly not, didn't know that I was, is actually watching TVW. But she's not the first, and I'm sure she won't be the last person that has said to me how much they enjoyed seeing TVW's coverage of the court, that they didn't know anything about courts before, but they could really understand what was going on, and they were fascinated. That to me is all the reason for doing what we do, that is having the public invited into our courtroom.